Welcome to our Red Thread study. This is chapter 13 in our Red Thread book. And whether you read this book or another commentary, there's all kinds of handbooks that overview the Bible. It's the same idea, just to get some kind of a perspective that's different than what I'm saying here. And then, of course, the most important thing you do is actually read the stories in the Bible. So we're looking today at the life of Samuel, Saul, and David. And each one of them has provides a beautiful picture for us of the principles of life, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I've titled this chapter, The Story of a King Who Failed. Really, that's talking about Saul's life. Our reading is from chapter 1 to chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. The covers about, this period of time covers about 113 years altogether. And then we move into David's reign, about 1000 AD, something like that. I usually put Abraham at 2000, David at Moses is around 1450, or you could say 1500, and then David at 1000. Then Nehemiah is 445. So if you take Abraham, Moses, David, Nehemiah, we get about 500-year time sections. It's easier to remember that way. I love the memory verse. It's a very poignant reminder of the power and the purpose and the responsibility that we have of praying for people. And Samuel says, "Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should cease to pray for you." This is a sin of omission. A sin of commission would be to say something derogatory about you or anybody else. But a sin of omission, you didn't do anything wrong, but you didn't do what was right. So he says, "Far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you." I have a spiritual responsibility and privilege of praying for Susan, my wife, Kelly and Christy, my daughters, their husbands, and my 6 grandchildren. First of all, I pray for the staff and my close associates, and then I pray for the church regularly. That's my spiritual responsibility. And if I don't do that, and if I don't pray for my neighbors, because there's no other Christians in our cul-de-sac, if I don't do that, I'm actually sinning by not doing what's right. Let me just, in the book, it overviews the main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David. There's a few other characters you'll probably see along the way. And then it gives you a bird's eye, 163, it gives you a bird's eye view of every chapter, what happened, chapter by chapter. That's kind of helpful for us to know the flow of the story. If you've been in Sunday school, you've been around, you know some of these stories about Samuel's birth and David and Goliath, those kinds of stories that stand out. But it's good to read that, kind of get a picture of this is the flow of what 1 Samuel is all about. Well, let's open our Bibles to chapter 1. And what we'll see here, remember that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse number 11, it says all these stories happened as examples or instructions to us upon whom the ends of the world have come. So what God is saying is that these illustrations, these picture stories, these biographies of Samuel, Saul, and David, and the other ones that surround their world, the smaller characters, are written for us. And the stories have spiritual implications. They illustrate principles, divine principles. For example, the principle of the flesh. Every one of us who are believers, non-believers and believers, but I'm particularly talking to believers, battle with this, the flesh. And I've used this verse before from Proverbs. There is a way that seems right unto man, but the end thereof is death. And that's the flesh. My flesh is my desire for recognition, my personal insecurities, my desire to be have money so that I'm comfortable. Any desires, maybe a title, maybe the respect of my peers, those are all things of the flesh. And they're not necessarily bad, unless they oppose the will of God. And so those attitudes are illustrated in the life of Saul, King Saul, whom we'll meet in a minute. Then we have the second story, actually the third story, is of King David. Now Saul, his name means, it comes from the root Sheol, which is death. Sheol or Hades is sometimes used as a synonym for hell. Not a very good name to name your kid, Saul. But really his life flows from a place of death. David's name means beloved. And it comes from a place, God is love, and so it comes from a place of God. So David and Saul, although they're both imperfect illustrations, because Saul had some good points to him and David had some bad points to him, although they're imperfect illustrations, through this story, Saul is a picture of the flesh and David is the picture of the spirit that opposes the flesh. So all of us live in every generation with this tension between the flesh pulling me this way and the spirit of life in Christ pulling me this way. And I'm constantly shifting between those two. And hopefully I'm moving, as I get older, I'm moving more and more into the image of Christ, into his likeness. And that's illustrated in the life of David. So Romans 8, let me turn to this for a sec. Romans 8, see if I can find this real quickly. Romans 8, verse number 5. Those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. I want things for myself. It's really self-centeredness. But those living according to the Spirit set their minds. We have the privilege of choosing where our minds go. We set their minds on things of the Spirit. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the things of the Spirit is life. Life and peace in verse 5 and 6 of Romans 8. So that's the illustration that we have in Saul and David. They're illustrating this tension, this pull of the flesh and the pull of the spirit and the conflict that we face in life. Samuel is the third, actually the first story. So Samuel, Saul, David. Samuel's story goes from chapters 1 to 7, and then it crosses over, and Saul's story goes from 8 to 15, and David's story goes from 16 to 31. Even though Saul continues on, it really becomes more the shrinking of Saul and the rising of David, the winning of the Spirit in David's life. So 1 to 7, 8 to 15, and 16 to 31. So the first story is about Samuel. And the word Samuel means asked of God or heard of God. And it's a great story. Hannah and Elkanah were two godly parents who had no children. Hannah would cry. Elkanah actually had two wives. And the other wife, and we live in progressive revelation, so they hadn't really been told not to do that yet at this point. We now are not allowed to do that. Not that I want it, but so he had another wife named Peninnah, and Peninnah had children, and she would constantly rub into Hannah, who Elkanah loved better. I have children, you don't have children. And Hannah was just getting so broken and so upset. And she went to her husband and she cried and cried. And he says, aren't I enough for you, honey? And she says, no, I want children. So she went to the priest, Eli, an old priest, fat. He wasn't a bad man, but he really was failing. The whole priesthood was failing in its authority, not so much because of the priest, but more because the people ignored the priest. They didn't listen to the word of the Lord. So she went to him, deeply distressed, and she prayed, and ultimately he blessed her and said that she would have her petitions. And she got pregnant. When she got pregnant, she dedicated Samuel to the Lord. Matter of fact, it's really the only place in the Bible that it uses that word dedicated, which means to lend him. And it's in verse number 28 of chapter 1. I've lent him, or I've dedicated him to the Lord. And what she did, when he was weaned, and Samuel would be about 3 years old, they would nurse a child for 3 years. And when he was weaned, she sewed a little priestly robe for him, a little miniature priest, and she took him to Eli, and he literally lived in the temple with Eli. I usually tell parents, don't do that. I don't want to look after your kids, but that's what she did anyway. And he became a junior priest at 3 years old, 4 years old, 8 years old. And every year she'd bring him a new outfit that would fit his size. he really was a man of God. And as he was the last judge, but he was also a prophet of God, and he really had the mind of God, the heart of God. Even as a boy, he heard God better than Eli the priest. And there's a story in there about that he heard God and the priest didn't hear God. Well, Hannah prayed a prayer in chapter 2, and she really hit the nail on the head. And when she said this in her prayer, chapter 2, verse 2, "There is none holy like the Lord. God, you're number one. There is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly." It says, humans, don't get so caught up in your self-focus, your self-centeredness. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, my mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, God's God, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. So if you want, there's always this tension between the self-centered, proud person who wants his own way and the God-centered person that wants God's way. And ultimately, if we want our own way, it will lead to death. And she nailed it in her song. It comes down to verse 7. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He will, verse number 9, he will guard the feet of his faithful ones. And so the song really illustrates God's heart, that if you want God to be with you and to fulfill his will in you, then we have to lay ourselves down as servants, because only God knows what he's doing. None of us knows. Now we have that illustrated in Saul's and Samuel's lives. Eli is rebuked by God in chapter 2. He's rebuked by God because he has not raised his boys well. We have a privilege and we have a responsibility to discipline our children, to discipline and disciple our children. And Eli did not do that. He's a good priest, but he was a bad dad. It's really worth it for us to read these verses from verse 22 down to the end of verse number 2, and it talks about the responsibility and privilege of a father that we have towards our sons to raise our kids to follow God. And if we don't do that, we're only one generation away from extinction. And that applies in this particular case to a man of the cloth, a pastor like myself. In verse number 26 of chapter 2 is a verse that's reminiscent of a verse that we find in Luke 2:52. Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, he grew bigger and he grew wiser, in favor with God and in favor with man, horizontally and vertically, favor with man and favor with God. So maturity is not just getting more knowledge, but wisdom as well as stature. And as my body grows, my wisdom should be growing. And my favor with God has to do with my relationship with God, and my favor with man has to do with my relationship with other people. So that's what it says about Samuel in verse number 26. Chapter 3 is that call of Samuel that I talked about. And then chapter 4 is a very sad chapter. The Philistines in this whole book are the primary enemy of Israel. The Philistines, as I said in my book here, the word Palestine, the Palestinians, now there's Christian Palestinians too, but generally the word Palestine comes from the word Philistines. And the Philistines were one of those 7 nations in Canaan who opposed God. And they're a picture of evil. In this story, in chapter 4, they came in, they raided the town where the Ark of the Covenant, which is the presence of God, was, and they stole the Ark of the Covenant. So remember the Ark, it's that box about 3.5 feet long, but maybe 1.5 feet wide, and it has in it the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and the bowl of manna. but above the ark is the two solid gold cherubim, and then the Shekinah, the glory of God, is between the two cherubim. This is where God came down, and this is where people could come to God through the high priest into God's presence. And the Philistines neglected, they disregarded the holiness of God, and they took that ark and they took it back to Ashdod, where they lived. You can go to Ashdod today. Susan and I were there a couple of years ago. We were on a ship and they docked in Ashdod, and that's that same place where the Ark of the God was captured and taken. Funny story, not funny to the Philistines. They had a house of worship for their pagan god Dagon. And so they took the Ark of the Covenant, and they put it in the temple of Dagon, and they set it beside their stone idol. And they left it there. It's the house of God, so let's put the Jewish God in the same place. They got up in the morning, the priest, the cult priest, went into the temple of Dagon, and they found the god Dagon flat on his face before the Ark of the Covenant. It had fallen in worship before the Ark of the Covenant. So read the story, it's a cute story. So they picked it up, and they put it back again. Next morning they got up, he fell flat on his face again. The head of Dagon broke off, and the hands of Dagon broke off before the presence of God. What a great picture story that is. Just before, that's chapter 5, just before that, one of probably the saddest paragraph in the entire Bible. When the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines, Eli, the priest, fell before. He was sitting on the chair. He was very heavy. He fell over backward and he broke his neck. It was a point of such low. It was just horrible. His son's wife was pregnant at the time, and because of the lowness of this point where the Ark of the God was captured, it was gone, the presence of God was gone, it was the low point of Israel, and because her father-in-law had died, the trauma caused her to give birth to her baby, and the baby came out, and she named her baby Ichabod, which means the glory has departed. And when Ichabod was born, that's the bottom of the barrel. So they couldn't wait. Philistines couldn't wait to get rid of the ark. They brought it back, and it's a temporarily, well, for 20 years, it sat in the house of Abinadab. That's chapter 7. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Chapter 8, the people come to Samuel, who's the judge and the priest, and they say, we want to be like everybody around. And they all have kings, and we want a king. Now, God says later, I think it's over here in chapter 9 or 10, he says, Samuel, it's not you they've rejected me. And wanting a king, when God was to be their king, the ideal order was that God was their king and they were all princes under the subject to God and his order. So it was a rejection of God. God says, give it to them. When I think of that, I think of if we had 2 glasses of water in front of me here. One was good fresh water, and one looked like good fresh water, but it had poison in. I have the freedom to choose whichever glass I want, the good water or the poison water. And God says, okay, that's your choice. But if you choose the one with the poison, then you are subject to the consequences that goes with your choice. So God said to Samuel, go ahead. If they want a king, it's not a healthy choice. I am to be their king, but if they want a king, you go ahead. But they're going to be subject to the pitfalls of having a human king. And so God does give us our freedom in choosing. Later on in Deuteronomy, he says those kings will have 3 major sources of temptation: women, sex, women, money, gold, and power. And those 3 temptations, sex, money, and power, have plagued any leader, women and men, especially men, through all of history. Part 2 opens up in chapter 9. Saul is chosen to be king. Saul, this son of Sheol, was a tall, handsome, naturally good leader, and he was chosen to be the king. He resisted the call. You find him hiding. You find him resisting God, but he was the man the people wanted, so God says, okay, he'll be the one. And Samuel came along and anointed him as king. And God did something. He says, it's a great chapter really, in chapter 10, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him and changed the heart of, it says when, verse number 9 of chapter 10, God gave him another heart. And Saul, this man who resisted being king, was given a soft heart by God. And he's the guy to lead. He's the guy that they've chosen. And God says that's fine with him. And he did really well. For a little while, he did really well. But the power got to him. Mostly the power. That love of authority, the controlling spirit got a hold of him. And from chapter 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, you see Saul as he rose up in power. He's king for 40 years, and it goes down, 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 down. And this really is the consequences of being led by the flesh. It's the way of death. And you see Saul go down, down, down. In chapter 15, God's had enough. Samuel says, I'm sorry, Saul, God's finished with you. You've been rejected as being king. But he still had more years to put in, but he was no longer the authority that God had chosen. And that's when God told Samuel to go to Bethlehem and find this family of Jesse. He's the grandson of Ruth. Remember from the last book we read, Book of Ruth. He's the grandson of Ruth. He has 8 boys. 8 boys. And from those 8 boys, God says to Samuel, don't look at their outward appearance. We're not looking for the biggest, the smartest, the best looking. We're looking for the guy that I've chosen. And that was young David. And God laid his hand upon David. David was anointed. Samuel poured oil over him. It was a wonderful chapter. It probably shocked David, shocked Jesse, shocked his brothers. And he was chosen above everybody else to be the new king of Israel. Not knowing, he's 17 years old, not knowing that the next 13 years until he's 30 would be testing time and character building times. So Saul had 13 more years to reign, not with God's authority, but to reign. But David was chosen in chapter 16, and then the testing began. Well, the great story is in chapter 17, where he fought this Goliath, 9 feet tall, and David proved himself. He became the hero of Israel, and that just hurt Saul, the man of the flesh, all the more, and he began to turn against David. So you see this ongoing struggle in these next several chapters to the end of the book. We see the struggle. Not that David's struggling with Saul. David is very submissive. And he had opportunities to kill Saul a couple of times. And David said, no, 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 I will not lay a hand on God's anointed. But Saul continually tried to kill David. So the spirit is very humble and takes his place as a servant, but the flesh is very arrogant and wants to kill the spirit, wants to stop you from serving God. So we see that ongoing conflict in these chapters that follow. David became very close friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. Jonathan means God is gracious, had a really good relationship with David. They became best buds. David ended up marrying Saul's daughter, Michal, although Saul's intent was to trip David up by giving his daughter. But he ended up marrying. So he's married as a son-in-law of Saul, but all this time Saul is trying to kill him. But even in this difficult 13 years, God is providing. You'll see many things that happen to David, very difficult times, but God is providing for him. Remember later on he writes, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And so David and Jonathan's constantly trying to protect David from his father. David ends up running away. He goes and he pretends, it's kind of a sad story really. He pretends that he comes to the king of the Philistines, and they know who he is, but David pretends he's insane. And so the king allows him in there because he's insane. He's no trouble for him. And even during this time of difficulty where David should not be there, God is still protecting them because he has good plans for him. There's a couple of conflicts between David and Saul. Again, David has opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't do it. Finally, chapter 25, verse number 1, Samuel dies. The voice of God dies. And it's pivotal. All Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his house. Then a story follows. It's a kind of a sad story. David has this army of men. He's chosen, I think it's 600 men that are now part of his ragtag army. If you go to Israel, you can go up, down by the Dead Sea, there's a wilderness area where David lived with his men, and they lived on nature, and it was that raising up an army and David learning to command an army was all part of his training process. But they had fought a battle, and he came to this very wealthy man, Nabal. And Nabal was a Jew, and he had a responsibility to feed any guests that came. And David said, would you please feed, if we could have some bread for my men, then I will pay for it and God will bless you. Nabal's name means fool. I don't know why anybody would name their son a fool, but their mom named him fool. And he rejected David's offer. So David came back and had a war with Nabal, and before he had the war, his wife Abigail, Nabal's wife Abigail, said, Nabal, you're a fool. You should not have done that. And now David's men are coming back. Nabal was so scared that David was coming back with the soldiers that he had a heart attack and died. And then Abigail, who had tried to help David, the wife of Nabal had tried to help David, was there, and David ended up marrying her, his second wife. David actually had 8 wives before he was finished, and many, many children. That was part of the downfall of David's life. He wasn't all good. Well, I need to get going here. Saul has done so badly. He's so fallen away from God. He's so out of touch with spiritual things that he no longer can contact God anymore. So he's lost Samuel. Samuel's dead, and he doesn't know what to do. So he figures, well, I might as well go to a witch. But Saul he'd made it illegal to be a witch. And so he had to find this witch, the Witch of Endor, she's called, an evil woman. But she had worked in hiding because it was illegal to be a witch. So Saul came to her and said, he disguised himself. She would be afraid if he didn't. So he disguised himself and said, would you bring up for me Samuel? I want to talk to him. Now, a witch really can't bring people from the dead, but it would bring kind of a ghost or an apparition, a pretend Samuel, and fake him through it. But God intervened and literally brought Samuel up from the dead. Samuel appears. The witch screams, what happened here? It's the real Samuel has come. And Samuel comes out of the grave, talks to Saul, and pronounces a kind of a death warrant on him. It's a very sad story, but it's the low point of Saul's life. We get to the end of the story. Saul is fighting the Philistines again, and the battle got very difficult, and Saul and his 3 sons were all killed. Well, you'd think that Israel would be happy, David would be happy, because the enemy, the flesh, has now died. But so the story is that he's very badly wounded. He has an arrow in his chest, maybe between his armor, and he's lying there. The sons are already dead. And so he says to his armor bearer, they would always have a young guy with him to help carry his weapons. And he says, just take your sword. He's lying on the ground. Take your sword, slab it through me. I have to die. Well, the armor bearer says, no way I'm going to kill the king's anointed. And so Saul says, well, okay. And he took his sword. He fell on his sword with his last breath, and he committed suicide. It's the ultimate death of the flesh. The armor bearer was so devoted to his boss that he also fell on his sword, and he killed himself. So the end of the story, the Philistines come, they take David, they take his head, they cut off his head, they take Saul, they cut off his head, they pin up his body in their temple, and Israel is so mad that they come and they take Saul back. And so 2 Samuel, we'll look at it next week, opens up. And David is not happy that his spiritual enemy is dead. He's grieved because the king of Israel is dead. And it just shows you the difference between Saul's heart, who's always trying to kill David, and David's heart, even though through difficult times he's always trying to honor Saul. So good. This is a new chapter as we open up 2 Samuel. It's the death of the flesh and the rise of a new walk with God under the leadership of King David. Let me give you a verse from Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 12. I've used this before. But it says, in the path of 12:28, in the path of righteousness is life. In its pathway there is no death. Proverbs also says that there is a way that seems right unto man, but the way thereof is death. And now we have this comparison of these two paths. Every one of us faces these two paths every day. The path of life, the path of righteousness, walking in the light, or the path of death, walking in darkness. That path, we have these two choices every day. The thoughts in our mind, the words in our mouth, and our actions. One path, it seems right to the flesh, but unless we're consulting God and listening to his voice, we're going to end up in death. And the other path leads to eternal life. That's the path I want to be on. And I pray for you as you continue to walk out your faith, continue to work your way through these luminous stories from the Bible, that God will direct your path, protect you from evil, and direct your path down the path of life. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.